If you're in the market for a cheap graphics card to upgrade your aging rig, or perhaps you're speccing out a gaming PC on a budget, I have some good news for you. Both AMD and Nvidia have released some brand new, reasonably priced silicon for your perusal. In the red corner we have the AMD Radeon RX 9060 XT, and in the green corner the Nvidia RTX 5060. But what you're probably wondering is, which of these new budget wonder cards should you pick in the year of our Lord 2025? Well, luckily for you, we've been busy extensively testing both of these new graphics cards in our mighty benchmarking rigs, and I've been tasked with breaking down the performance difference between the two, and advising you on which to buy in 2025. My name's Andy, and I'll be your somewhat cheerful host for today. So, let's get cracking then. The battle of the bargain GPUs awaits. Before we start, it's important to point out that comparing both of these cards in an apples-to-apples comparison isn't as straightforward as it first appears, mainly because they use significantly different architectures. The RX 9060 XT is part of AMD's new RDNA 4 lineup, whereas the Nvidia RTX 5060 is an RTX Blackwell-based GPU. In the RX 9060 XT's case, you get a 199mm squared die size compared to the RTX 5060's 181mm squared version, and 29.7 billion transistors compared to the 21.9 billion you'll find in the Nvidia card. However, putting the two spec sheets next to each other, you'd be forgiven for thinking the AMD GPU is down on shader cores compared to the Nvidia competition. Technically, the RX 9060 XT has 2048 compared to the 3480 you'll find in the RTX 5060. But, as with the other cards of this generation, AMD gets a lot of graphical horsepower out of what looks like a smaller number of shading units overall. When it comes to clock speeds, the AMD card ranges ahead with a 3.13 GHz boost clock compared to the 2.49 GHz max speed of the RTX 5060. Again though, this isn't necessarily reflective of the performance difference between the two. If we're talking VRAM, the issue gets even thornier. We've only received a 16GB variant of the RX 9060 XT for testing so far, whereas the RTX 5060 comes in 8GB configuration only, at least as things currently stand. However, I'm still going to be directly comparing the two today, as the extra VRAM of the AMD card should really only come in handy for 4K gaming, which isn't exactly its forte. Or the RTX 5060s, now I come to think of it. Nope, these are both 1080p and 1440p graphics cards aiming squarely for the budget end of the market, which is reflected in the relatively low power draw of both cards. In the case of the RX 9060 XT, it's got a rated TGP figure of 160 watts, while the RTX 5060 is even gentler on your PSU with a TGP of 145. Both cards are very efficient when it comes to how much juice they demand from your wall socket, but the RTX 5060 gets an early win for that positively minuscule wattage figure. As we're looking at the 16GB variant of the RX 9060 XT today, you won't be surprised to learn that it's more expensive than the 8GB RTX 5060. That being said, on paper it only comes down to a $50 difference between the two, as the AMD card has an MSRP of $349 and the little Nvidia card is supposed to retail for $299. And as for the 8GB version of the RX 9060 XT, it's also $299. Yep, that's exactly the same price as the RTX 5060. All things being even. Probably. Under ideal conditions. Okay, so you may be asking yourself why I'm using particularly vague language when it comes to describing the price of each of these GPUs. Simply put, graphics card pricing at the moment is... let's just say it's complicated. Ultimately, while manufacturers are still happy to put an MSRP figure on their new releases, they're often much cheaper on paper than what you'll actually pay when you put your card details in at the checkout. For the purposes of this comparison, I'll be taking those MSRPs at face value, but it's worth mentioning that pricing can and will change with the wind at any given opportunity. You should be prepared to pay more than the MSRP for most graphics cards right now, that's for sure. What can I say? It's tough out there in the PC hardware market at the moment. Although it's worth noting that we spend much of our time hunting for the best cheap graphics card deals, and you'll find a link to the cheapest we found at this very moment in the description below. So, what do we get when we put the RX 9060 XT up against the RTX 5060 in our notoriously tough benchmarking suite, just chock full of demanding games waiting to wreak havoc against our budget contenders? Well, at 1080p it's pretty clear that the RX 9060 XT establishes a commanding lead. In Black Myth Wukong, the little AMD card manages a 73 frames per second average result, a full 9 frames faster than the RTX 5060. It also delivers a much higher 1% low reading of 63 frames per second in comparison to the RTX 5060's 48, which translates to a smooth real-world gaming experience. In Cyberpunk 2077, it's a close-run thing, with the RX 9060 XT scraping the average frame rate win by a mere 3 frames. Still, the AMD card once again manages to deliver a higher 1% low result, and when it comes to keeping the frames in the somewhat smooth range, those minimum frame readings really count. At 1440p, the RX 9060 XT extends its lead over the RTX 5060 by a considerable margin. In fact, we found the AMD card to be roughly 15% faster on average across our benchmarking suite at this particular resolution, which is quite a significant difference when trying to maximise the bang for your respective buck. Our real-world 1440p gaming benchmark results, with quality upscaling and frame generation enabled, tells a similar story in many games. The RTX 5060 does manage to squeak the occasional minor FPS lead, but overall, the RX 9060 XT pulls ahead. That being said, if Homeworld 3 is your particular jam, you should know that the RTX 5060 proved to be 5 entire frames faster at 1440p native, and 3 frames faster in our real-world upscaling enhanced testing, which would matter if you were buying a graphics card for its performance in one particular game, which you shouldn't. No, seriously, you really shouldn't. Anyway, the RX 9060 XT puts the Nvidia RTX 5060 firmly in its place in most of our tests at both 1080p and 1440p resolutions, and that's a pretty impressive result, even when you take into account the $50 price difference between the 16GB Red Team card and the 8GB Team Green contender. Still, the mention of that VRAM difference means I should probably talk about the 4K performance of both cards, and my advice is, forget it. Unless you're playing something particularly undemanding, neither of these GPUs make for smooth 4K gaming machines, which shouldn't come as much of a surprise given the price. That being said, the RX 9060 XT does provide a reliably higher frame rate result in most of our 4K test suite, if you can call a 22 FPS result in Black Myth high. Yep, if 4K gaming in the latest, highly demanding games is your goal, you're probably going to have to open up your pocketbook a fair bit wider and start taking a look at mid-range to high-end options instead. I don't make the rules, folks, I merely test graphics cards for a living, and these are not the 4K droids you're looking for. When it comes to overclocking, the little RX 9060 XT doesn't have a whole lot of juice left to give. I managed to squeeze out a few extra frames with a simple 300MHz core memory overclock, but it's clear that the AMD card has been pushed pretty close to its limits straight from the factory. Even our favourite undervolting trick doesn't work for this particular card, as even minor adjustments to the voltage results in a crashy, unstable experience. By comparison, the RTX 5060 is actually quite a capable overclocker. Our Dave managed to push his review sample up to a 425MHz core overclock with a hefty 1500MHz boost on the memory, which is pretty good going for any modern graphics card. That being said, this only results in a few extra frames performance at most in the games in our suite. Should you end up with the Nvidia card, I'd say squeezing a bit more out of it with a simple overclock is well worth doing, but it still won't do much to close the gap between the RTX 5060 and the RX 9060 XT overall. So, now we've had a look at the performance between the two, it's time for the million-dollar question. Which should you buy with your own money? Well, given the performance difference I've demonstrated here, I'd definitely plump for the RX 9060 XT over the RTX 5060, even if I had to spend $50 more on the 16GB version. And while we haven't yet had a chance to test out the $299 8GB variant, I'd be willing to guess it'll provide comparable results. It's the same chip after all, and while 16GB of VRAM is a nice thing to have for the future, the extra memory shouldn't make much difference to the 1080p and 1440p performance as things stand. Again though, we come back to price. Looking at the retailer listings, the brand new RX 9060 XT has something of a price premium on it at the moment, although that's likely to drop off as initial demand for AMD's new Wonder card wanes. Still, I'd only buy the RTX 5060 instead if I could find it for much cheaper. It's simply a little off the boil in comparison to its new AMD competition, so I'd only really consider it if I couldn't get hold of an RX 9060 XT for reasonable money. Ultimately, pricing has been the big contention point for GPUs of this generation, and even the budget cards aren't entirely immune from retailer markups. Still, who knows what our economic future might hold, although I'd be willing to bet that both of these cards will carry a premium for some time to come. When it comes to choosing between the two, however, the RX 9060 XT delivers a superb amount of bang for your buck, even if it does end up being a bit more expensive. Many have hoped that AMD's new budget card would put the metaphorical cat among the metaphorical pigeons, and it appears to have done exactly that. Whether Nvidia will respond with price changes of its own to counter its newfound AMD threat is anyone's guess. But as things currently stand, the little RX 9060 XT is certainly delivering the better value proposition at this end of the market. Competition is a good thing, and it'll be very interesting to see how Nvidia responds to this new budget GPU threat. So, should you be shopping for a new graphics card at this very moment, I'd highly recommend our cheap graphics card deal page linked in the description below. We're always on the hunt for the best deals on a variety of gaming hardware, and we collect all of the latest GPU deals here for your perusal, so make sure to give it a check before you part with your precious cash. Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that we have an entire website, pcgamer.com, for all your hardware and gaming needs, along with this very YouTube channel, jam-packed with hot PC gaming content. So, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button below. Until next time.